But it's really just a privilege to introduce David Mayhew on this occasion. And in one sense, he's obviously a person who needs no introduction to any of us, in that we've all been learning from his work, assigning his work for many years. But I guess to me, what's striking as I look back and think about David's career, spanning now over almost 50 years and still going quite strong, is how he's really transformed our understanding not just of Congress, but of many core features of the American political system. So this is a career that really starts with his first book, Party Loyalty Among Congressmen, and to his most recent, Partisan Balance, Why Political Parties Don't Kill the U.S. Constitutional System. David has taught us so much about the role parties play in our political system, both in representing the public and at times making policy and at times failing to make policy, and teaching us about that. He set scholarly agendas in several subfields. Mo Fiorina referred to the work on divided government, where basically launching a whole cottage industry of studies of the impact of divided government on legislative productivity and gridlock. His book, Electoral Realignments, a critique of an American genre, really single-handedly moved scholars away from one line of inquiry and hopefully into more fruitful ways of thinking about American electoral history. Now, David Mayhew is most famous, as we've talked about a lot in the first panel, for his book, The Electoral Connection, Congress, The Electoral Connection, which, as we talked about, really revolutionized the way we study Congress. But to me, I guess my appreciation for that book and the true testament to David's kind of intellectual role in the field is to juxtapose that book in some ways with a book he wrote almost 30 years later called America's Congress, Actions in the Public Sphere. Now, the Electoral Connection, as we've talked about, is an exercise in useful simplification. It takes a very simple idea, simple premise, and through clear-headed reasoning, shows us how far that premise can take us to understand politics. America's Congress is a much different book, at least on the surface. Rather than simplifying and abstracting, it focuses on specific events and individuals, and is really focused on the question of, when we think about what is it that members of Congress do that's significant, what can we learn about the nature of the political system we inhabit and the role of Congress in maintaining that system? And so it's coming at it from a very different perspective, and one of the key insights there is that one of the things members of Congress do is not just respond to voters' preferences, but they're actually actors in a public sphere helping to shape public opinion, shape public debate, and that's one of the most important things members of Congress do. Now, I think what's striking is that while these two books come at Congress from two very different angles, they share that common Mayhewian analytic sharpness, that's kind of bite, where you just see these insights that leap out of this initial move. He makes a simple move at the start, this simplifying assumption in Congress, the electoral connection, this idea of thinking about what is it that members do that's significant in this later book, and then uses that insight to then generate a whole series of new ways of thinking about how Congress works. And so I think, to me, coming from at the institution from these two seemingly opposite lenses, you see this same common kind of intellectual structure. Now, I was fortunate to have studied at Yale with David Mayhew, and I think I was here for 6 years, from 1991 to 97. I can report we did have graduate seminars in American politics while I was here. My first class was actually the field seminar with David Mayhew. And one of the things that stood out to me was coming from a small liberal arts college where I was kind of used to just sort of spouting off with great, what I thought was great political wisdom about how American politics works. I would hand in these short essays, and David would come back at me with, where's the evidence for this claim? Exactly what's the logic behind this argument? And I just wasn't, and quickly he kind of disciplined me to think about how, just the importance in that we want to be theoretical, we want to make big claims, but we also need to really know the stuff of politics. We need to have empirical bases for all of our claims. And so I got that early on and then continued throughout my time at Yale. I think the thing that stuck out to me most is long lunches at Clark's restaurant with David, working on, as I was in the process of taking my vague idea for a dissertation and trying to turn it into something practical and feasible. And so we would spend these lunches, and there'd be 2 hours, 3-hour lunches where we would go over the prospectus, the latest prospectus draft or chapter draft, and David would give just painstakingly detailed comments, and we'd work through the various problems, issues, discuss difficult cases, alternative explanations. And, I can say the food at Clark's, it's not something all that memorable. But the mentoring experience I got there is something that stuck with me to this day and just taught me how to be an advisor to graduate students. And so I'd still now, when I think about my own role as an advisor to students, I think to myself, well, is this the kind of level of feedback, engagement, and close just care that David showed to me and really made a tremendous difference in my development. So I would say both from his research and from his work as a mentor, I really learned about what it means to be a scholar and to contribute to not just your own research, but to that of future generations of scholars. And so with that, I welcome David Mayhew.
Up here so I can see. This is so I can see. Yes. I'm going to have more to say later. I'll be back. But right now, I've got a particular assignment given to me by Alan Gerber. Particular assignment, and I'm not supposed to talk. He told me anyway, more than 15 minutes. It's now been elongated into 20, but here we are. This was the assignment from Alan. This book, about which we had the panel this morning, the Electoral Connection book, which was now 40 years ago, as written actually 40 years ago, published 39 years ago, as Doug said, 30 years ago. Written, where did it come from? Where did the book come from? What is the genesis? What are the origins? How did this get on the boards and such? This book now, which is this is a kind of personal archaeology here. This is going back a long time. It's longer in time than almost anybody else, possibly anybody else for that matter, in the audience can go. I may be the oldest inhabitant in the room, come to think of it. Not by much in some instances, but still I may have the record. There it is. Now I want to give you some ingredients. Again, this is archaeology, but it says something about the times, about the context, and about as the Yale department, as well as the profession, as well as the country. It's this time back in the 1970s or so. Here are some, where did the book come from? Where did the book come from? Electoral Connection, okay? Here are some ingredients. I've got, I guess, 5 ingredients and then some thoughts to grease together the end of a discussion. First of all, I'd been reading a lot. This virtually the only thing I know how to do, which is to read. I don't know how to do numbers or game theory or interviews. Interviews with people strike me as being a horrible thing to have to do, structured or otherwise. I wouldn't know how to do it. I can hardly use the telephone, but I know how to read. I know how to read. I really know how to read. I've always known how to read. So it's a background, a very important background. It's kind of a literary background. The writing of this book in the mid-'70s was that I'd read a lot. I've been reading a lot for a long time. I'd read a lot as an undergrad at the graduate school. My advisor at graduate school at V.O. Key, I'd virtually memorized everything that V.O. Key had written, and some of the other kind of analytic style moves that you find probably in my advisor Key would be evident in what I was doing later on. It was there. Also, I read the Congressional Record. I noticed that one of the papers, I think I've read all the great papers. We'll talk about them later, at least I will. One of the Lipinski-Clinton Katz-Nelson paper, I think they counsel us to read the Congressional Record. Isn't that true back there in the 1930s and 40s? You really should do that, Just look and see. Get a sense of the context, the content, look in, see what's going on, see how people are voting. Get the flavor. There's a lot of the flavor, actually, of the Congressional Record. In fact, some quotations in my Electoral Connection book. And I used to get it every day, the Congressional Record, hard copy. It turns out that I think at that time, every congressman, there were virtually all men back then, had 25 free subscriptions to the Congressional Record in the district. And I got one at an early time, and for maybe 12 years, I got the damn thing every day. And I really would look at it. I'd really look at Congressional Record. I probably spent an hour every day with the Congressional Record going through it. Of course, it'd be stupid to read every word, but there it was. And this was before Congressional Quarterly amounted to much. It was on the boards, but it was very thin. There wasn't a national journal. I was nowhere near the Washington Post, and there it was. So this was a major source. There it was. You had to do it. That's one thing you had to do. After the secondary work by journalists on the Congress was not all that great compared with today. Also, what I did is still under point number one about reading. After I got out of graduate school, which was in '63, the fall of '63, I discovered that I didn't know much about political science. I'd taken some nice courses, and I loved my courses. I loved the setting. I loved what I learned, but I knew virtually nothing about political science. So what I did was to go back in all the journals that had articles about American politics, anything to do with American politics. There are not that many journals then that did this, but there were some. All the way back to calendar 1950. That is, I systematically went through all the journals from 1950 through whatever it was. I got it 1963, 64, and I continued this after that for years, reading and clocking all these pieces about American politics. I still have the cards. There's a stack of cards that thick, index cards. This is also before computers, just tanking up whatever there was in the way of knowledge, accumulated stuff about American politics, particularly about Congress, but also elections and other stuff. State politics at that point. State politics was a bigger deal in studying American politics then than it is now for a political scientist. I did all that. So reading. So there's a reading base going into the 1970s, which was, as I say, that's what I chiefly know how to do. Secondly, I had time on Capitol Hill. And this is a great big piece of fortune for me. In the mid-'60s, the APSA Congressional Fellowship, a great big piece of good fortune. And I really do recommend it, counsel it. And we've talked about this. People trying to get into the trade should really go down there and do it. I've talked to Keith Crable about this. I think Fennell told me you just got to go down there and do that. Where's Keith? Did he tell you that? Yeah. You spend time in Bob Dole's office, which is very valuable. Isn't that correct? It's just very, very important to get oriented, to get a sense of the place, what kind of stuff goes on in the place. I did that. I went down in '67, '68 in the Congressional Fellowship. I worked in our House office, and I worked in the Senate office for a while. I also worked in the office of the Democratic Study Group for a few weeks down there. Actually, this is a prefaces what Gary Jacobson and I were later fussing with in the early '70s. Their campaign finance data that I systematized for them, their campaign finance contribution records back in '67, '68. Did that, but very valuable on the Hill was watching how the members operated. As a congressional fellow, I had access to the offices. I could sit right in the offices of the folks, the House member and the Senate member, and see what they did during the day. And there it was. And I think a lot of my electoral connection book comes out of that perception, or my perception, my reading of what they were up to as I watched them operate as people came through the office. I watched them operate on the floor. I went back to the districts. I went back to New Jersey. I went to Montana. I could see that people dealing with their constituents back there in the settings. I could see that. This is very valuable. And I remember with my House member from New Jersey, I think that I, without thinking about it very deeply, I coded what he was up to, probably, and what I later put on paper as the set of categories of position taking and credit claiming and advertising. I'd see that, not exactly in those terms, but I could watch my boss and I could see people would come through the office, and for people in Trenton, there would be goodies, distributive politics. For the unions, it would be solicitude, accommodation. We'll do what you want, insofar as it's possible. For the Princeton folks, it was positions. The Princeton folks loved positions. And my boss, he doubled his campaign finance contributions to the Princeton area by coming out against the Vietnam War, and he knew what he was doing as he came out with his position against the Vietnam War. They loved positions in Princeton. It was there it was, a kind of differentiation of effort, and you could see the man putting on different kinds of, you could actually see different kinds of skull, whatever, caps as he was operating with different kinds of constituents as they did come through, and also see him operating out there in Trenton, going and visiting the gin mills and such, which I did a little bit with him. It's fascinating stuff, just fascinating stuff. I was just watching. I didn't have any project in mind. I was just, at that point, or this project in mind. I was just watching to see what they were up to. All right. That's two ingredients. A third ingredient of the book, which has been talked about in a general sense this morning by some of the panelists, is, after all, the political setting of the late 1960s and mid 1970s. Now, it's very clear that some things were happening. That is, the incumbency advantage was rising, it was surging. At least it seemed to be the case. And actually, it's now been clocked by Steve and Jim that this is going on in a lot of electoral realms. After all, back in the 50s, we know that now. There's better evidence on these things, but we could see it, especially involving U.S. House members, in the 1970s. We could see that. We could also see the well, that seemed to denote a kind of individuation of politics that hadn't been quite there before. We could see the increase in the programs that were generating casework, as Mo wrote about. We could see an apex of cross-party voting on Capitol Hill. That is to say, not party v. party, but rather something else in the politics. Often in the 1960s and 70s, and all of American history is a trough, as we know, in party voting in probably peaking in so far as a trough can peak, peaking in the 1970s, something like that. There it was. These things were happening, and that was the setting. And some of us were resonating to the same setting doing that, and Mo's talked about this. Bob Erickson was writing about incumbency advantage in 1971, before I got onto that wagon, you know that. But it was out there. Independently, we were responding to the same environment and changes in that political environment. And I was struck this morning listening to Gary. I hadn't quite thought about this before, by watching his charts there, looking at his charts, that as of 1973, when I wrote that book, I'd been watching politics for a quarter of a century, which tells you something about my vintage. I mean, it goes all the way back, and I could see one of the properties of the evolution that went along with that vintage, that I could see the change over a quarter of a century producing this politics, or emanating in this politics, which is not an end point, but there it was, emanating in this politics of the 1970s, which did entail cross-party voting and individuation and incumbency advantage shoot up. All the way back. I mean, I have memories all the way back to 1948 and 1950. And actually in 1948 and 1950, the 50s, in my dim now memories of that, will resonate to Gary's charts, which was that the cleavage in the country back in those days was indeed quite partisan by comparison with the politics and voting, congressional voting and such in the 1960s and 70s. I could see that back in my home room, in my elementary school in 1948, Democrats versus Republicans, for example. It was virtually a religious census of Protestants versus Catholics, really, I think just about perfect, a census of Catholics in my village, Catholics versus Protestants, and I was a Protestant. We got whomped in my village. We Dewey people got whomped by the Truman people. I think it was 21-6 in the elementary school. I couldn't understand that until some years later I realized it was the emanation of the registering of a religious census. I still have clippings in the file from 1950, elections all the way back there. So the point I'm making here about this is that I was sensitized by Gary's charts to the point that as of 1973, I'd been seeing the evolution of changes toward what we were seeing in the early 1970s for quite a long time. I mean, I was seeing, yes, and in some places in the book, this comment about how things are changing in this direction. And indeed, they seem to have been. There it is. That's the political setting of the time. The fourth ingredient is this one, of the writing of this book. It has to do with the Yale intellectual environment of the early 1970s. I got here in 1968, and some of you folks have talked about this. Gary was here then. A little later than that, a little later, Doug Arnold was here. Chris Aiken was here then. And Yale was a hothouse department at that time, after all, in the profession. And it was, the environment was, here was the environment, as I think it impinged on me around 1970 so at Yale. There was sharp analyticism was in the air. That is, that was what was valued, the sharp analytics of some kind or another, as opposed to what? As opposed to gassing on, as opposed to doing whatever. Sharp analytics, something like that. We saw it in, that's unkind, because it is unkind, because some of my own writing, after all, doesn't have sharp analytics, but amounts rather to gassing on. So I don't want to, I want to be a little careful here. But it was the Bob Dahl was here, after all, and Ed Lindblom, Bob Lane, they were the oldest, the most senior members of the senior faculty at that time. Joel Apollombara was here, Juan Lintz was here, David Apter was coming in. At the junior level, or not junior, but junior level, or somewhat younger level after all, Jerry Kramer had come aboard. And he was a smart, fearsome figure was Jerry Kramer. Stern, that is intellectually stern, was Jerry. There was Doug Ray, who was a walking expositor of analytics, as was Doug Ray around 1970s. I was joking to remember. Looming in the background was Martin Shubik out there. Another fearsome figure was Martin Shubik, whom I did not know. But some of our students dealt with it. I think Doug Arnold says in his paper that he did work. Is this true? Did work with Martin? Did you go see Martin? Where's Doug? Yeah. Yes, Shubik and Kramer, right. So there it was. This was the environment. And that was the environment I was operating in, or trying to operate in at that time. And another figure, or another writer, who was not at Yale, but was very important in the intellectual context. The swing of the time was, it's also been mentioned by Doug Arnold this morning, Anthony Downs. Now, he wasn't here. He was at Brookings or something. I don't know where he was. But his what is the name of it? Economic theory. There it is. Was very, very, very much out there. And it was much favored in the Yale department, that book. It was promulgated, used, just out there. Ed Lindblom was a big fan of Downs' book, for example. It was in the air, the Downs' book. And that was very important to me as a theoretical enterprise. And I remember a particular point, actually in the writing of the electoral connection, the Downs book does erupt in a particular way. I was teaching a graduate seminar one year in the early 70s, and I think I was using Downs' book. I must have been doing that. And going into class, it occurred to me, well, maybe I could do something useful by generalizing, or rather complicating what Downs was doing in his basic thinking, which was that parties, after all, are point source entities that compete with each other for elections. But suppose you take that premise to the congressional level. So you're not dealing with just one presidential candidate or one party or something, but rather with an assembly or two assemblies of 535 people. How does the Downsian premise launder into the environment of 100 and 435? And that's what induced me to make the distinction, I think it did anyway, having watched my boss in action on Capitol Hill, between position taking and credit claiming. That is, these are not emphases that arise so easily or quickly to the head as one thinks about presidents or about parties running things. Whereas with 535 individual people, they leap to the head more easily. So that was there. Yes, that's number 4, the Yale intellectual environment of that time. A fifth ingredient was this one. The Electoral Connection book it's a theoretical essay. That's what it is, a theoretical essay. And somebody said to me once, "Did you write that over a weekend?" No, I didn't write it over a weekend, but it is out. It is rather short and rather simple, after all, in some ways. After all, the structure is simple, and it's not a quantitative enterprise, except for a few fugitive charts. It's really it's a thought enterprise. And how was one to do that? I mean, what was the basis in political science, or the tradition, or the acceptance rate for writing theoretical essays? I mean, that is not where things were going, or where they seem to have been, for that matter, writing theoretical essays, whatever exactly a theoretical essay is. But But I did that, and it's a form of presentation that I decided to move into in 1973 or so there, and I think there are a couple of precedents for that. They were in my background. A couple of models for me. I was trying to figure into doing that. One was Louis Hartz, as I studied at Harvard with Louis Hartz quite a bit. Louis, he of the liberal tradition in America. I had 3 courses with Louis Hartz. That was the first place for me as a course-taking experience at Harvard. And it's quite outside my domain, after all. Louis is he's doing European political thought. He's doing chiefly that, plus the liberal tradition in America. But what the liberal tradition in America was a book which was very in the front of my head in the 60s and 70s, and it's a theoretical essay note. What he does is to take a pretty simple idea and take it through a lot of terrain, make it visit a lot of terrain over American history. That is, he puts through a particular idea through a lot of material. That's what. Then the more proximate model, I would say, for getting into the theoretical essay I did was Bob Dell's work. Bob Dell's work, in particular his work, A Preface to Democratic Theory. A Preface to Democratic Theory, which was written when? I guess in the 1960s, or maybe even the 1950s, I don't know. Well, it's still a very important book, after all, and it is exactly a theoretical essay that has Bob Dell's preface. It's not long, it doesn't have numbers in it. It's a thought piece which covers a fair amount of terrain and plays through it, a premise about democracy, which makes some wrinkles along itself as it goes through the book. And it's fairly short. I mean, he could have written it in a weekend, maybe. I'm sure he didn't. So that was, it was a kind of a model, I think. I'm not even sure I thought it out as being a kind of a model, but I do think probably that the awareness of the Hartz work and the particular Dahl work, the preface work, were in my arsenal, or not exactly in my head, as I went into writing the electoral connection in 1973. All right, those are the 5 ingredients then of getting into that. It's my assignment from Alan. And so it's the book came together in 1973. I wrote it, and I did some prefatory couple of essays that I screened out a couple of years earlier, which Chris Aiken reminded me of the other day. I'd virtually forgotten about them. But I wrote the book in the summer of '73. It took about 13 weeks to write, which is more than a weekend, about 13 weeks. I had it all lined up. I had a stack of cards to write from. That is the quotes and the references and such that I had stacked up during the preceding academic year. I've never succeeded in writing and teaching at the same time. I just can't do it. It's like Jerry Ford. I don't know how to do those 2 things at once. I couldn't do that. So I needed the space, the time, the slack, the summer actually to do the writing, flat out, without interruptions in it, and that's what I did in the summer of '73. Actually, that was the summer of Sam Ervin's hearings, and that was one of the 2 big Watergate summers. That's the one in which Sam Ervin and his folks took the skin off Nixon and his folks in that summer. So but I couldn't watch them during the day because I had to write. So fortunately, one of the channels, they would tape them and then run them at night. So I'd write during the day and watch Sam Ervin at night to find out about Watergate, what had gone on in that setting during the day. It was a lot of fun. And the writing went rather smoothly. There was only one glitch, as I remember it. I thought the whole thing out pretty well. There was one glitch. It was having to figure out how to define credit claiming, and I wrestled with that for a while. And I was never satisfied with what I got. But then I adopted, I think I consciously did this, a move that Bob Dell sometimes made in his writing, which is to say that, well, I can't solve everything here, so let's just do the best I can and get beyond it, get to the next paragraph and the next page. He commonly did that, and that's what I did with credit claiming. It's got some holes in it. I know it's got some holes in it. It's got unclear boundaries, but I had to stop. I had to go on to the next page, so I did that. But generally speaking, the whole thing went pretty smoothly. And let me show you something. Recently, in those days, we wrote in handwriting. I mean, for youngsters, that's nearly inconceivable. This is certainly before computers. It's also before I think it's before electric typewriters. At least there it was. It was. In those days, what you would commonly do if you're writing something long is to put it in handwriting and then send it to a typist. So that's what I did. I put it in handwriting and I fished it out. I've got it here in handwriting. Now this is a photocopy of the handwriting. I think the typist never gave back the copy, But operating on an insurance principle, which I very commonly do, I made a photocopy of the whole thing before I sent it to the typist. You really do want to do that. I mean, there are these stories about dissertations being lost in a trunk and the car stolen. That's very common. So this was the result of doing the photocopying. You take it and putting it in the closet. I just took it out a few months ago and take a look at it. There it was. And that was it. Just writing it and getting it over to and I had to write something or else I was going to lose my job very quickly. So the summer of 1973 was very critical to that. Joe will remember that. I had to get that stuff on paper. Even there it was. That was it. And then I wrote the book, crafting this, theoretical enterprise. And then I stopped. I never did anything more on that front. There it was. I just stopped. I had said everything to say about it that I wanted to say, and that was the end of it. That's it. That's the end of this.
For questions for about.
Maybe they won't. Yes, Mo.
You were mentioning models for the kind of essay you wrote, and you didn't mention Schatzschneider, and I wondered about that.
Now that's an interesting point, and I think maybe you're right about that. It's quite, especially semi-sovereign people. That might have been also in my, yes, it might have been there also. That's another very distinguished, after all, theoretical essay. I think maybe you're right. So let's, magnify by 50% my claim and add on Elmer. I think that's probably right. But what else can you think of that would be of that? It's not that common, was it? It wasn't that common, was it? No. Excuse me?
Exit voice loyalty?
Probably a bit later. I mean, most people didn't write that sort of a thing. Where's exit voice? I don't remember when it was. I see, but I wasn't aware of it. I don't think I was aware of it, no. It was outside poli-sci sufficiently, so that, or at least I wasn't reading it. There it was. But most people didn't do that. My advisor, V.O., didn't write. Key didn't write. Fenno didn't write theoretical essay. I don't think so anyway, yes. Well, I wouldn't know. I don't think so. I think that's more elaborate. It's got more in it. It's got more, it's more of a production, congressmen and committees. It's really got a lot of also interview material. I wouldn't put it in the same bucket, I don't think. I don't think I would anyway. I don't think so. But you're right about, I think Schatzschneider, that's quite right.
So
and I knew that. I certainly knew his work. Yeah.
So David,
three books. Excuse me?
No, David, you end your story with the completion of the work. And I'm
Yeah.
interested in, and you never came back to it. I mean, it's actually interesting. I'm sure you were asked many times to do a second or third or fourth edition. Well, you didn't do the second, so you don't get to do the third or fourth. So I'm curious about what the immediate reception was, was to the book.
We're aware in the American politics, the academic world. I think it was picked up pretty quick within 2 or 3 years. I think it was, yes, picked up pretty quick. In the public affairs world, not so much. I mean, it was reviewed by Walter Shapiro in the Washington Monthly. It had a little bit of a public face, though not as much as, obviously, much as some works do. But yes, it got picked up pretty fast. But then I stopped. I think one reason I stopped, I stopped chiefly because I didn't have anything more to say on this point. I mean, there it was. But then spooning forth a few years, the rational choice analysis, I really didn't know how to do. I mean, I knew how to do simple premises, but I had no training, and so therefore, obviously, was not capable of carrying forth the whole business in the elaborate fashion that rational choice training would have supplied. Nor was I interested in doing that, really. I mean, I was interested in moving on, finding some other kind of thing to do. And generally speaking, what I have done is to move on, to do something somewhat different. Yeah.
What do you think of this many years later? What do you think of the idea that congressmen are using this as a user manual? How does that strike you?
The congressmen are what?
Are using this as a user manual?
Good Lord, I don't know what I think about that. It's kind of, I really don't know. It's, I don't know if I like it. It's, it might be better if they're doing something else. But what can I tell you? What can I tell you? Yeah, yeah.
Every author cares about how many books is it sold, how many copies is it sold.
Well, I really, in leaving aside used editions or something. I mean, there's a market in used, marked up used. I don't. It's something like 100,000, maybe something like that. But I really don't know. I lost track a long time ago, and I never got much in the way of royalties. You want to stop? Pardon? I think so. I think it helped them a bit. True enough, right?
So actually, when you ask a question, just wait for the mic to come to you.
Okay, sure enough. I see. That's because I'm become hard of hearing. At least that.
Yeah, for the video.
Maybe that's the end of it.
Any more questions?
Maybe we want a round table. People want round table.
I just wonder if you'd say, you said a word about Louis Hartz as a teacher, if you'd say a bit about V.O. Key.
They were very different. Louis, as teacher, Louis Hartz was charismatic in seminars as well as in lectures. Really was. Just following. Pied Piper kind of guy was Louis Hartz, and for good reason. Very good reason. Just very good reason. V.O. was very different. V.O. was soft-spoken, low-spoken, recessive. Didn't really care. Was not a star undergraduate teacher and didn't try to be a star undergraduate teacher. He ran a workmanlike undergraduate course. In seminars, he ran kind of V.O.K. I had a couple of his seminars, by the books seminars on subjects. I had one on legislative behavior. I think he was terrific, but he's just a different kind of presentation from Louis. Very right, yeah. Always very, very good. Also, V.O. was very, very, very helpful to me. I mean, respectful. I read my work when I put in front of him. I remember I gave him my first 3 chapters of my dissertation, and I had a chart, and the axes are upside down. The X was the Y, and the Y was the X. Oh. And no, you can't do that, blah, blah, blah. He vetted and corrected my first 3 chapters and veered me toward doing the whole business better. And then he got sick and never recovered. V.O. Yeah. In '63, he did. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Dave.